How are you feeling, Professor?
Oh, I'm feeling okay. It's good to see you, Aubrey. It's always such a joy to talk to you and to explore issues about China and the U.S.-China relations and geopolitical relations and all of those things, and just to help our listeners and viewers understand what's happening. So good to see
Yeah, and good to see you too. And it seems like every time, you know, I think this is probably always been the case, but it just feels like every time we plan to talk about something, the world shifts and we talk about something else. So, we were planning to talk about the Trump Xi meeting that was scheduled for the end of March, early April of 2026. That was supposed to be in Beijing, but this meeting has been, pushed back now a couple weeks. We obviously know that President Trump is focused on the US Israeli war. So, I have a couple other thoughts of things that I want to talk to you about, which are kind of timely and interesting. But what are your thoughts on the delay of that meeting? What's the impact for, the US China relations, but also the US economy?
So it's a great question, and we have a team in China, and they're sort of our boots on the ground, and so I've asked them and just to try to get a sense of what the feeling within China is about this, and so my comments are going to reflect my own views, but also their views. I think it's a mistake. I get that we're in the middle of a war, which is I think a sad and disturbing fact, but the U.S. Israeli Iran situation is a big situation, and I think there are many people in the United States that wish the president would have thought through this a little bit more and talked to Congress about it. And but this was a very very quick unilateral action. And but the issue with the delay of the trip, in China, people within the government, but also in Chinese society, were very much looking forward to this trip because you'll remember that we've talked about the sort of cycle of relations over the last year. President Trump came to power in January of 2025, so about 14 months ago. And, it was a very disquieting and disturbing time because suddenly there was an upping of the trade war, tariff war set of issues. From that period until about September of 2025, it just seemed like U.S.-China relations were just cycling downward and going into a very negative space. But the reason September of 2025 was interesting, you'll remember, is because President Trump met with Chairman Xi in South Korea, and he referred to the meeting as the G2 meeting. Like, this is a meeting in which, Chairman Xi, you and I, we are the countries that are running this world. And this was a big sort of honorific, but also, the Chinese, we've talked about this before, this it's very disquieting in China that, there's this group of seven nations, the G7, and then there's the kids table, which is the G20, which are generally developing nations. And, China, people in China think we're the second largest economy in the world. Like, why are we at the kids table? I mean, so Trump referring to this meeting as the G2 was, I think, a very, very powerful moment of saying, like, okay, like, we are in partnership in influencing what's up. And I think this particular meeting in late March, early April, was viewed as a continuation of that sort of narrative, that dialogue. I mean, people were very much looking forward to it. This was Trump visiting Beijing. There were a lot of sort of honorific things that were going to be discussed and rolled out. It was going to be a bit, leader to leader moment. And there has been some disquiet over the last couple of weeks because it hasn't seemed like the Trump administration was actually preparing in a way for this. And so they weren't sending people to Beijing to really sort of think through what the content of the meeting was going to be like and what the honorific things were going to be like. But of course, that's partly because, we're at war. And so Trump is very focused on, I think, evening out those issues before having a meeting. Now, recently I was listening to a podcast in which one of the individuals was saying, well, this is because they want to make sure that they have everything ironed out before they have a meeting between Trump and Xi. In my personal view, Aubrey, this is a mistake because what Trump needs to be doing is thinking about Xi and treating Xi as a partner, right? I mean, the more that he emphasizes the extent to which we are the G2. We are the two largest economies in the world. And yes, the United States has taken some unilateral action here and really gone aggressively into the situation with the Strait of Hormuz and Iran. But in my opinion, it would have been an opportunity to sit down with Chairman Xi and say, we need to be partners here. We need to be thinking about how we're going to resolve this situation together. And so instead of it looking like this is, some kind of tension that, the US is taking kind of control and maybe even pushing back against China because China has supported Iran and China saw itself as the broker of the peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It feels like Iran is a pawn in this global game. And in my opinion, it would have been better if they were sitting down as partners and President Trump saying, listen, Chairman Xi, I need your help. Like, we need to work together on this. Let's be partners. Let's be the G2. And so I think it's a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's a missed opportunity for that powerful relationship to continue to build. But it also seems like a missed opportunity for American businesses because, we've talked about this as a team, but there was discussion of, China investing in the United States in our manufacturing supply chains to help us be strong, like the current administration wants us to be. And, so there's we've got China willing to invest, and as we've said many times, China has the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world, and to have that investment in the United States would strengthen our economy. But that conversation, if it is happening, is continuing to be delayed.
100%. And thank you for raising that issue and reminding me of it and reminding our audience of it. Yes, the key issue of the power of China's manufacturing supply chain is fundamental. There is a reason that, companies like Apple, Tesla, and Walmart are so deeply embedded in China. And it's because China has the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. It's not just because of cheap labor, it's because of the sophistication of the manufacturing supply chain. But, you know, we've talked about this before, but the whole point of a tariff or the trade war that's driven by tariffs is to raise prices at the border so that there is incentive to create and build more manufacturing supply chain and therefore more jobs in America. But the problem with that logic is that you don't just raise prices and suddenly have a manufacturing supply chain. It takes time to build a sophisticated manufacturing supply chain. And so we need help and partnership. We need investment. I mean, the key example that you and I have talked about before is the example of TSMC, chip manufacturing company from Taiwan, made a decision to invest $500 billion in the state of Arizona to build manufacturing fabrication factories. The impact of that on the Arizona economy is tremendous. I mean, it just changes so much. I mean, think about $500 billion. I mean, that's, that changes the economy fundamentally. And so, to your point, one of the things that our team has talked about is how would we work with more Chinese companies to think about building factories and building manufacturing supply chains in the state of Michigan or in other places in America. And that kind of partnership is healthy and better.
Right.
And so we need to continue to think about that partnership. And I wish President Trump would treat this more like a partnership than sort of a competition and a trade war. And so I think
Right.
that's what people in China were anticipating after the September meeting in South Korea. They were sort of thinking like, okay, this is moving away from just a toxic trade war into a partnership. Let's continue
Mhm.
this. And I think people in China, well, I know people in China were expecting that this March, early April meeting was going to continue that conversation. And so the fact that now the Strait of Hormuz and the Israeli Iran situation has kind of gotten in the way of that, I think it's very disappointing to many people.
Right. Well, speaking of supply chain and manufacturing, I think the interesting topic we can talk about today, which was a different American leader visited China recently, and Tim Cook visited China on March 18th. And as we know, he is the leader of Apple. So I guess maybe before we get into that, tell us about your history with Apple briefly, and then let's get into that conversation about Tim Cook. Why'd he go and what happened?
Sure. Yeah, and thank you for the question, but also thank you for the introducing my history. So I worked for Apple. So I worked there from 2014 to 2019. I was the head of Apple University in China. And so, I was sort of continuing my professorial work. Apple University is a really, really interesting organization. It was started, founded, and run by a good friend of mine and somebody who I admire tremendously. His name is Joel Podolny. And I knew Joel. I mean, he and I come from sort of a similar world of economic sociology, and he was a professor at Harvard and then was the dean of the Yale School of Management, and then was recruited by Steve Jobs to build Apple University. And Apple University was a very brilliant and interesting. There are many corporations have universities, but usually they're sort of about basic training um, uh, of different corporate functions. But Apple University was very focused on how do we build healthy leadership and a healthy organizational culture. And so Joel was brought in to do that. And Joel and I had known each other because we come from similar backgrounds academically and intellectually, but also he had been a part of Harvard when I visited and taught there. And then we've just known each other. And then when I had my sort of downfall from my deanship at George Washington University, Joel called me and I started talking to Joel and Tim Cook and trying to figure out maybe I should come join Apple. And so I became the head of Apple University in China. And the why in China was because, one, I was teaching the leadership development and organizational culture stuff for, a very large and growing, workforce in China. But I also, because I'm a bit of a China expert, China's a complicated place. And so they needed somebody to help them kind of think through how to navigate the era of Xi Jinping. And so Xi Jinping comes to power in March of 2013. He was inaugurated March 14th, 2013. And every year on March 15th, there's something called Consumer Day. And it's basically a moment when the Chinese government calls out a company, usually it's a foreign company, to say, you know, you're not being a good enough citizen. And so I was watching this as it was happening. At this time, I was still dean at George Washington University. Xi Jinping is inaugurated March 14th, 2013. March 15th, Consumer Day, 2013. One company is called out. That little company was called Apple. And so it was sort of I was just watching this and I was like, oh my goodness, something real is happening here. And, at the time, it was something about, tax policy and, the fact that, and I remember when I was talking to Apple in the early days, the leadership team was like, we got this. It's okay. It was just a tax issue. And so we're fine. And I was like, you guys are not getting the symbolic nature of this. Like, this is a big thing. They're calling you out because they want better partnership and better collaboration. And so over time, I became somebody who helped, sort of advise the Apple administration on how to deal with the Chinese government. And, that stuff has been written about in Patrick McGee's Apple in China book. And it was an interesting journey and a fascinating time. Eventually, I had to leave that position and then I needed to get my family back home. My then wife and kids were very, very good. I was very honored that they spent 5 years in China with me, kind of dealing with my own obsessions of, U.S.-China relations and U.S. But I needed to get them back home. And so we left 19. But yeah, it was an interesting journey. And I've always been honored by the fact that I was able to help Apple navigate the era of Xi Jinping.
Right. And because I think that because of your sort of intimate familiarity with Apple in China, I think you may have some, additional insights on the visit. But so, Tim Cook visited China recently on March 18th. So tell us about that visit. Seems like they're talking about, supply chain. They're talking about a lot of things in addition to, and we'll get to this later, but, cutting prices in their app store. So let's start with the visit itself. And um, what was the focus?
Well, it's a big symbolic moment. I mean, President Trump is a very important person and he needs to sort of coordinate his visits with everything else he's doing. But Tim Cook is a very important person too. I mean, he's the chairman and CEO of the first or second most profitable and valuable company in the world. And, so where he spends his time and when he goes to places have big symbolic moments. And so the fact that he showed up in China on, you know, March 18th was a big deal. Now, this was not just sort of a random visit. I mean, I think it probably was tied to the fact that, and again, I'm not an insider with Apple anymore, so I don't know the details, but I'm sure that they were thinking about the fact that, well, okay, Trump and Xi, US and China, like, let's make sure that it's clear that we're part of this, important conversation set of conversations as well. But this was also tied to, I think, to an anniversary event. I think it was the 50th anniversary celebration of the Apple Store in Chengdu, and so I think they wanted to just show that like we are celebrating a long relationship, right? And so like Apple and China are married because the supply chain is so important. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. Apple works with over 1,600 suppliers in China. It's not just Foxconn and a few final assembly places. It's, more than 1,000 suppliers that build all of the components and modules, then assemble the iPhones. But there are also many stores, right? So like it's not just that Chinese cheap labor and you know, the magnificent manufacturing supply chain that build iPhones is there, but there's also a huge consumer market, right? And so, this is the 50th anniversary of, one of their earliest stores. It might be the first store, I can't remember. But so that was a part of it. And of course, if somebody like Tim Cook shows up, you're not just going to get, somebody sitting at a table in a store, celebrating. You're also going to get many meetings with government officials and those sorts of things. And so I'm sure it was a very important meeting. When I was working for Apple, the few times that Tim came, you know, these were big events because, we needed to organize big meetings in Beijing and in Shanghai and in top level government places and really kind of make clear that we knew what the strategic focus was and we knew what the sort of Apple China relationship was. And so I'm sure I know all of those things were happening on this quick visit. So I'm sure it was very significant in terms of his participation in the celebration, but I'm sure there were many, many relationship building things with the government and strategic focus issues as well.
Right. What do you think about what is the signal that Apple is lowering its app store rates? It looks like, mainland China, the commission was 30% and it's now 25% starting, on March 15th. So what does that mean, do you think? And how do you think that came about?
Yeah. So this is an interesting case. And, I've had many Chinese interviewers getting me on the phone wanting to know, like, what does it mean that Apple's lowering their app store margin from 30 to 25%? I don't think it means very much. I mean, so first, well, let me step back and say it doesn't mean very much for Apple in terms of costs or profitability. It means a lot in terms of a symbolic approach to what's happening. So let me just say a little bit more about that. The App Store revenues for Apple are relatively small in terms of what they are, what the company is worth, right? I mean, the company is again one of the most profitable and most valuable companies in the world, but the App Store revenues are just a small piece of what they do. I mean, they're a hardware manufacturing company with other things like an app store, but the app store is a relatively small portion. I don't know exactly what the numbers are, but it's relatively small in terms of what they do. In China, it's very small in terms of what they do. And so, you know, the idea that they'd be cutting their margins by 5% from 30% to 25% is not going to mean a lot for the Apple bottom line. Now, what means a lot for the Apple bottom line is good relations with the Chinese government and good relations with Chinese suppliers in the manufacturing supply chain. So again, this is one of the things that's really interesting about Apple's positioning in China is that, you know, Apple isn't just working with Foxconn and a few final assembly factories. It's working with more than 1,000 factories that are building the components and modules, but it works with industrial clusters, right? And so these industrial clusters are all companies that do similar things that all compete with each other for Apple's time, right? And one of the magical things about what Apple does, and this is, I think, the brilliance of Tim Cook. Tim Cook is one of the smartest business people I've ever worked with. His focus was not just on getting a partnership with a factory that then would produce a component or a module and then final assemble for the assembly for products. His focus was in helping local governments build industrial clusters around given issues. And those industrial clusters would then all compete with each other for Apple's time. Right. And so, like, the ability to work with Apple was a real benefit to them. And they would work with Apple for very, very low margins. I mean, Apple would obviously always pay costs, but these suppliers would so much want to work with Apple that they would work for very low profit margins because they could then use everything they learned from Apple about building an efficient manufacturing supply chain and turn around and make their money from Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, all of the other competitors. So it has become a real partnership because, if Apple just wanted to, build iPhones in Chennai, India, they can do that, but they're not going to get the same kind of competition for their attention and building an efficient manufacturing supply chain as they get in China. And so, the relationship is a very close and tight one, but it's dependent on this very, very, very diverse and productive manufacturing supply chain. And so, as I always say, like, the US is married to China and Apple, Tesla, and Walmart are married to China. Like, it's just, they're not going anywhere. And so that's really where the heart, in my opinion, the heart of Apple's productivity and profitability in the world, but in China exists. The App Store is not it. Okay. And so, the idea of cutting App Store profit margins from 30% to 25% is just, you know, it doesn't really hurt Apple's bottom line. But it's a nice gesture, right? It's a
Right.
gesture where it doesn't hurt the bottom line of Apple so much, but it can be celebrated. And, people in the Chinese government can say, see, did you see what Tim Cook just did? He just cut the margins of the App Store from 30% to 25%. Like, he's our partner. And so it's a very nice sort of moment of like, okay. But in my opinion, and again, I'm not on the inside of Apple anymore, but in my opinion, this is not a big thing for the bottom line, but it is a nice symbolic thing. And
Right.
so,
Yeah. And I think that's one thing I've learned, from you and just learning about China, and how, everything from, the partnerships at the highest level to the partnerships on the street level. It seems like that symbolism is really important to people in China where it may not be as important to us. But I think that's one reason why you're, being that broker between Chinese either government or companies and the United States and the companies that you work with that you understand the culture and how to relate, and that I think that's just really that's important.
well, Aubrey, I love that you said that and framed that way, and thank you for the compliment, and in terms of my thinking about these things. But here again, remember, when I teach leadership in the global political economy, and particularly focusing on China, like to often, help corporate executives and help students think about the symbolism of things like, you know, Tim Cook going to China or what these things mean. But there's a deep history here, right? Like, I mean, China for 2,000 years was the most powerful economy in the world and the most innovative economy in the world. And, a lot of the things that kind of changed the global political economy, like nautical compasses and gunpowder, and, these all came out of China. And then China sort of had an inward focus in the early Ming Dynasty and built the Great Wall and, and then horrible things happened. the first and second Opium Wars happened. The Sino-Japanese War happened. China's, I mean, what literally is referred to in China as the century of humiliation from about 1839 to 1949. And, so China kind of grew up, and communist China grew up on that structure. But then, after Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1970, 78, 79, and sort of reopened China, I mean, China has been on a tear of building the most powerful manufacturing supply chain in the world, and they're very proud of it. But there's a deep history here,
Mhm.
so being paid respect is important. The idea that they're being recognized not just as the kids' table at the G20, but that, the United States is thinking about them as the part of the G2, which doesn't really exist as a
Mhm.
formal structure, but they're being, called out and treated as like, okay, we recognize you're the second largest economy in the world, and we all need to work together. And so those things are important on the geopolitical level. But then when people as powerful and as important as Tim Cook go visit China, the symbolic nature of this is, like from a cultural perspective, people see it and they recognize it, and they will probably buy more iPhones,
Yeah.
instead of when they're given a choice between a Huawei phone and an iPhone, they'll be like, well, Tim Cook just came here, and so it's a powerful. And I'm sure they weren't thinking of it as a marketing tool because, Tim was going there to celebrate the company's relationship with China, but also do strategic meetings. But like, you know, I'm positive that the people on the marketing team will be using the fact that he was there.
Yeah, and presence matters. So just going back to sort of the interconnectedness of the US-China relations and, Apple and China, you have said frequently that, the United States and China are married. And, I just did a little quick search about how many jobs Apple, kind of creates either directly or indirectly in the United States alone. And the number that I'm seeing is like 2 million, right? And Apple and China are deeply embedded with, Apple's supply chain, as you've mentioned, the intricacy of having that partnership and the importance of that partnership, not just on Apple as a company, but on the citizens of the United States that have jobs there. And so, this isn't necessarily just something that impacts Apple at the high level and, China at the high level. It's impacting consumers, helping you mentioned earlier that Apple is, one of the most profitable companies in the world. So they have a lot of responsibility to their shareholders, but also to their employees to, keep everything moving. So I think to me that speaks to it's just not like high level relationships. These are, you know, intricately woven relationships that it is difficult to just shift, right? So these relationships are important to manage. So how do you think that fits into the larger picture of you know, just the things I mentioned? How does this impact me as a citizen? How does this impact, the folks that are just on the ground in China?
Well, I love the question, and thank you for doing more detailed research than I have on this in terms of what the actual numbers are. But here again, one of the things that's really important is so there are jobs that are created in America, which are, in Cupertino, and, there are not that many jobs, but then there are jobs that are created in China, which is its major manufacturing hub. But one of the things that's important again to remember is that Apple doesn't just own a few factories in China, which was the sort of early model version of how foreign investors were investing in China. Foreign investors would come over to China and they would set up a joint venture relationship and they would have a factory. But one of the things that China has done to become a powerful source for manufacturing is they've built these industrial clusters that are part of an industrial supply chain so that suppliers can always be feeding into different factories. So to give you another example, you know, Tesla has its largest gigafactory in the world in Shanghai, right? Now, that is actually a vertically integrated factory that produces final components and final products, Tesla cars, except even in their case, they work with a lot of suppliers that are sort of feeding into from the industrial clusters into the components that go into things like Tesla cars. And so similarly with Apple, they're working with 1,600 suppliers who are building modules and components and ultimately doing final assembly that feed into those. And so it is true that the building of this important thing, this important product called the iPhone, creates a tremendous amount of jobs in China. Except one of the benefits of how these relationships work is that these suppliers aren't monogamously, married to Apple, right? Like they can work with whoever they want. And so what they learned from Apple in terms of how to build, efficiently running manufacturing supply chains, they then can go use for the markets for all companies that want to build smartphones. And so that relationship again is a really important thing. So the only reason I raise this is that when we talk about creating jobs, of course, being the centerpiece or the central place of creating the vast majority of smartphones in the world, but iPhones in the world creates jobs, but it also creates learning, right? And so this is one of the reasons that we were able to get the government to recognize Apple's labor spend in China as fixed asset investment. And that was a big thing that happened in the time that I was there because, other people have written about this. Wayne Ma at The Information wrote about this. But it was an important moment to really get the government to acknowledge that this isn't just the search for cheap labor. This is also what we're calling fixed asset investment because Chinese factories and Chinese suppliers are learning from Apple. And so it was sort of a moment of really recognizing the sort of marriage and the supply chain learning that was happening and the partnership. It was just so it was a really important time, and it's just for a geek of global supply chain management like me, it was a fascinating time.
Okay, that's really interesting because I would not have considered knowledge a fixed asset, but it is in this case. And I think the case for calling it a fixed asset is that, once people learn something, it's there as long as it's in their brains and it's something that they can share. And so it becomes part of the collective knowledge. It becomes an asset. And I think that's a fascinating way to position that. Yeah. And I think, we've learned probably both sides have learned,
Yeah,
important things as we've, been in this relationship. It's not one sided. There are benefits that go both ways. And I do want to clarify the 2 million jobs that I mentioned earlier that I had, said Apple is responsible for. That is not just Apple employees, it's app developers, it's,
right,
hardware, like it's sort of the
right.
ecosystem. And so, yeah, I think that's a very important thing to note is that we want Apple to be strong and we want the relationship between Apple and China to be strong because that is a pretty big number of folks who are depending on relationship for jobs. So I want to talk about, we can't ignore, what's happening in Iran and in the Strait of Hormuz. There's a lot going on and there's a lot shifting. By the time our listeners hear this, the world will have changed once again. How do you think Tim Cook's visit to China relates to the conflict in Iran?
Well, here again, it's a great question, Aubrey, and I'm not an insider in what's happening in Apple anymore, so I can't. I'm just watching the from the sidelines as we all are. But here again, I think the key issue is, there is a real drive in China right now to sort of have this G2 perspective and to really be recognized by the United States as kind of a leader in this. And as we discussed early in the call, or early in the conversation today, I think I know just from my China team that people in China are disappointed because they were very much looking forward to the Trump visit. And, the idea that Trump is now distracted with a war, which, it's I wish this would have unfolded in a different way. And there would have been more negotiations and China would have been involved in those negotiations, et cetera. But he's obviously distracted. And so, that's been hard for the Chinese citizenry because they were really wanting to be a major voice at the table. And in my view, it would have been better if we would have kind of dealt with the situation in the Middle East with, bringing China to the table and saying, let's, we're the two most powerful economies in the world. And then there's this other group of economies called the G7. And like, let's all be talking about this stuff. And so I think it's been very disappointing in China to not have a seat at the table. And again, as I mentioned earlier, in China, they were very proud. And, I know people in Xi Jinping's administration, they were very proud that Xi Jinping brokered the peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so, and of course, you know, China has significant exposure there because of oil, and the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. And so it's a big issue and a big moment. And so here again, I think that Tim's visit is, the Apple people are very smart in terms of their manufacturing supply chain, their business dealing, but also their marketing. And so I think it was a moment of, you know, the leader of one of the most powerful companies in the world showing up and reminding China that, like, we're still here and we're partners. And, our important, powerful leader is going to show up and remind everybody of that. And so if it's related to the conflict in the Middle East, I think it's much more just tied to reminding China that we know that we're all here together, and Apple is deeply embedded in China and the United States is deeply embedded in China. And so, let's just all calm down. And so my guess is that that's sort of the symbolism.
Right. And what are the thoughts of the OGL team in China about Tim Cook's visit? And just question about that.
But people are very disappointed with the delay of the Trump Xi meeting. They were very much anticipating this idea that China is being brought to the central table and we have a seat at the table. Mm, And so, that's been very disappointing. But here again, Tim Cook showing up, you know, very important, busy, powerful corporate executive showed up, and he went to the anniversary event in the Chengdu store. And, he then had important meetings in Beijing, I'm sure. And so I think people were very, you know, again, I mean, it sort of goes back to your question about the cutting of the rates from the App Store to 30% to 25%. My guess is that Tim Cook showing up is going to bump up the sales of iPhones in China by a lot, because suddenly people are like, okay, the CEO of one of the world's most powerful companies just came here. And
Right.
so I think it's probably a very positive thing for Apple, and net, they're going to win.
Yeah. And the goodwill goes a long way, it seems. Final thoughts, what all this means for US China relations and where we're headed.
Yeah. So it's a great question, and thanks for putting it sort of in the broader context, because here again, as you know, I mean, I'm very committed to the idea and talk often about the idea that, we need to be very careful here. U.S. is deeply embedded in China, and so like the idea of tariffs and a trade war, you know, which can suddenly solve, all of the U.S. economic problems and create jobs in America is ridiculous. Like the real key thing is that we're married to China. We're so deeply embedded in China, and major companies. And I always list Apple, Tesla, and Walmart, but there are many, many, many that are deeply embedded in China. And we can't just be, you know, suddenly thinking that, okay, well, we're just going to go get cheap labor in Vietnam and India and Southeast Asia. Like, it's not how it works. And, manufacturing supply chains that are sophisticated and powerful take decades to build. And so, to me, it's just really important that we're always very careful about these issues. And, I also, and I speak as a China scholar, but also somebody who's spent a lot of time in China and knows how people think, they need to be treated as a partner. They need to be treated as a powerful partner. And I think Tim Cook's visit kind of affirms that. But I think President Trump's delay of his visit, diminishes that. And so I just think we need to be careful and thoughtful. And, I wish as we were going into this situation in the Middle East, we would have treated China as more of a partner than sort of an adversary who's getting oil out of the Middle East. I mean, I think it's not smart politics. And so I think it's a really interesting time, Aubrey, and it's an interesting time. Just for today's conversation, we were going to talk about, the Trump Xi visit, and then that was delayed, and then we're talking about the Tim Cook visit. Like, let's just think about like how those things add up, right? Like that's the thing. Is like this is, a geopolitical situation, but it's also an economic situation. And so I think I love the way you framed the conversation because it sort of allows us to see that both of those things are so important right now.
Right.
So thank you. It was amazing.
Yeah. Thank you for the conversation today. I appreciate it, and we'll do it again next week.
I will look forward to it, Aubrey. Thank you.